Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, January 2nd, 2023. All right. First, I just want to wish everybody a happy new year. Hope everybody had a good weekend. I thought it would be pretty slow, but we actually have a good amount of stuff here to go over. So the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the head of NATO says that sending more weapons to Ukraine is the quickest path to peace. So this is Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, and he said this in an interview published on Friday. Again, he's saying that the quickest way to peace in Ukraine is through NATO countries sending more weapons. He said this in an interview with the German news agency DPA. He said, quote, "It may sound like a paradox, but military support for Ukraine is the fastest way to peace. We know that most wars end at the negotiating table, probably this war too, but we know that what Ukraine can achieve in these negotiations depends inextricably on the military situation," end quote. So his comments come, of course, as I have been going over a lot lately, as there is no indication that Ukraine and Russia are going to be coming to the negotiating table. Kiev maintains that its goal is to push Russia out of all the territory it has captured, including Crimea, while Moscow vows that it's not leaving the areas that it has annexed. Ukrainian officials are also demanding that Russia face war crimes tribunals before talks can even begin. Now, while Stoltenberg, he's saying that arming Ukraine is the fastest way toward peace, this support from the West has emboldened Ukraine to make these demands. And its hardline positions are unlikely to change as long as the aid keeps flowing. The only way Ukraine's going to be pushed to negotiate is if the U.S. and its allies leverage that aid to get them to make some concessions. But we also don't see that happening anytime soon. And Stoltenberg, he recently acknowledged the dangers of supporting this proxy war against Russia, warning that it could lead to a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. But Stoltenberg insists that the West must continue arming Ukraine despite these risks. And he did another interview over the weekend where he said that NATO countries need to step up weapons production. He says Ukraine needs an enormous amount of ammunition for artillery. They also need spare parts and maintenance. And he says that NATO countries need to ramp up production. And a lot of them are already doing that, especially the U.S. This recently signed NDAA that it includes all these amendments to increase weapons production. That's just going to be a total boon to all the weapons makers in the United States. So they're making out pretty handsomely on this policy. All right, the next article here. Putin and Zelensky, they both vow to keep fighting in their New Year's addresses. So both the Ukrainian president and the Russian president delivered New Year's Eve addresses to their countries where they vowed to continue fighting, as again, the war shows no sign of slowing down in 2023. In his speech, Putin reiterated that he has no intention of leaving the areas Russian forces have captured and annexed. And now that is the Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. They control most of Luhansk. I have a map in here that we could look at, but they still don't control a good portion of Donetsk. They control most of it. And also Kherson and Zaporozhye, those other two oblasts that they annexed, they also don't control all of them. But they're saying they're not going to leave. And Russian officials have also said that they plan to try to capture all the territory in those oblasts that they annexed. So in his speech, Putin took aim at the U.S. and its European allies, saying that the West lied to Russia about peace while preparing for aggression. And it sounds like he's referring to recent comments from Merkel, the former German chancellor. She said in December, pretty recently, that the Minsk Accords that were brokered by France and Germany, and these were the deals signed in 2014 and 2015, meant to end the war in the Donbass war that was going on for all that time before Russia invaded. That's what those deals were meant to end that war. But Merkel said recently that they were meant to give Ukraine time to build up its military. The argument being in 2014, Russia could have rolled in a lot easier than they did, 8 years later. So I'll read this quote from Putin. He said, quote, "Today they are no longer hesitant to openly admit it and to cynically use Ukraine and its people as a means to weaken and divide Russia. We have never allowed anyone to do this, and we will not allow it now," end quote. So he's right, when he says they openly admit this, because, of course, Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, did say that a U.S. goal in Ukraine is to weaken Russia. The Russian leader concluded his speech by vowing that Russia would continue the fight. Then over in Ukraine, Zelensky gave an address, and he said, in the previous 10 months of fighting, Ukraine has shown the world that it doesn't need to make compromises, and hinted that he would never agree to Russian demands of neutrality. So I'm going to read the quote from him. This is from the Ukrainian presidential website. It's the English translation, so it's a little choppy, but it sounds like he's saying basically that Ukraine is never going to be neutral how Russia wants it. He said, quote, "This is the year when Ukraine changed the world, and the world discovered Ukraine. We were told to surrender. We chose a counterattack. We were told to make concessions and compromises. We are joining the European Union and NATO," end quote. So it doesn't seem like, the U.S. or NATO told Ukraine to make concessions or compromises, because they have been discouraging peace talks with Russia this entire time. But I see what, he's saying here, and still kind of holding on to the dream of joining NATO, which, the U.S. giving Russia some kind of security guarantees when it comes to Ukraine could have prevented this whole thing, potentially. But the Ukrainian leader said that he wished for victory, which, again, according to Ukrainian officials, they have pretty maximalist goals, because they're still saying that they want to drive Russia out of Crimea. And Ukraine has retaken some territory, Kharkiv and Kherson City. But overall, the territory has not changed hands much since Russia went in and captured all this territory. So if you're watching the video, I put this map in here from South Front. And if you could see where the red is outlined, that's what Russia controls. So it hasn't changed much, but you could see also they outlined the oblast. So you could see, if you just listen, you could go check out this map. So you could see, the territory Russia controls in these oblasts and what they are saying that they're going to take. And I do think this is Russia's focus now. Who knows exactly what their end game is, but I think at least in the future, we might see it in offensive to take these areas. But who knows? It's really tough to predict this war, because a lot of people have been saying, Russia is preparing for this winter counteroffensive, not a counteroffensive, but a winter offensive after they mobilized 300,000 troops and they reinforced their positions along the front lines. But they haven't done that yet. What they've been doing is just, bombing the hell out of the rest of Ukraine. And there's been a lot of heavy fighting here in the east. And according to the numbers put out by the Russian Defense Ministry, there's a lot of heavy Ukrainian casualties. And of course, Ukraine is not really putting out their casualties. So we don't know, if these Russian numbers are exactly right, but it does seem like there's a lot of people, a lot of Ukrainians dying in these battles in the east. But what to expect in this next few weeks? An offensive by Russia? Maybe. It's impossible for me to say. But again, it's just what we will expect is this war to continue. And while the battle lines haven't changed much, we're not seeing, this red growing. Things are still really bad for Ukrainians because of all these strikes across the country on the infrastructure. And those continued on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. There was Russian missile and drone strikes across the country. So again, just a really horrible situation for the people of Ukraine. All right. So the next article here, Israeli strikes shut down the Damascus airport. So Israel launched more missile strikes on Syria early Monday morning, targeting the Damascus International Airport and putting it out of service as Israeli airstrikes against Syrian airports have become a common thing now. This is a pretty regular occurrence. According to the Syrian military, the missile strikes killed 2 Syrian soldiers, wounded 2 more, and they caused some material damage. Israel, they rarely comment on their operations in Syria, and so far they have not acknowledged these strikes. And Israel frames its bombings of Syria, its whole campaign against Syria, as attacks on Iran and Hezbollah, or they say that they're targeting, Iranian weapons shipments into Syria. But they often kill, as these strikes did, they often kill Syrian soldiers and they often damage civilian infrastructure. Again, they took out an international airport. And it marked the second time within 7 months that Israel put the Damascus airport out of commission. And the UN said, so the last time that they bombed the Damascus, actually, no, not the last time they bombed the Damascus airport, but the last time the strikes caused enough damage to put it out of service, the UN said that they had to halt the delivery of aid flights into that airport for 2 weeks. So that's how serious this is. That's what this can impact. Right now, it's not clear how big these strikes were on Monday, the latest ones, or how long the airport might be out of service for. But, it must be pretty serious if they're saying that it's shut down. And Israel also recently targeted the Aleppo International Airport. So Syria's other international airport, they bombed in September multiple times, and it was shut down for a few days as a result. So again, they frame this as attacks on weapon shipments, I guess. And Syria, I think they deny that they're receiving weapon shipments through these airports, but maybe not. I'm not sure. But either way, even if they were, I mean, does that give Syria the right to bomb Israel's airports where U.S. weapons are shipped in? I mean, that's just it's just absurd, this idea that they have the right to bomb a country's airport because they're getting weapons. I mean, it's just it's just more pressure against the people of Syria who are facing all this economic pressure from the U.S., from the sanctions, and now they get their airports bombed. It's just a mess. And also, I didn't realize when I was writing, I didn't think about it when I was writing this, but I guess this is the first Israeli airstrikes in Syria under the new Netanyahu government, which, of course, we expected this to continue, but, who knows if there's going to be any difference, if he's going to be bombing Syria more or less, or kind of keep it at the same rate. We'll see how that plays out. The next one here, 10 oil field workers killed in an attack in eastern Syria. So this is according to Syrian state media. 10 oil field workers were killed in an attack on Friday that hit a bus in Syria's eastern Deir ez-Zor province, or governorate, as they call it. But according to the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the attack was carried out by terrorists linked to ISIS, but that report is not confirmed. I didn't see the Syrian government say that, and nobody took responsibility for the incident. But the workers were killed while on their way to the Al Taim oil field, which is under Syrian government control. Now, most oil fields in Syria are under the control of the U.S. and their Kurdish allies, the SDF. And that's how the U.S. is able to occupy a pretty good chunk of eastern Syria, is by backing that Kurdish group. And so the U.S. and the SDF, they control all of Syria's oil and gas fields in Deir ez-Zor, in the same province, that are on the east side of the Euphrates River. So if you're watching here, you see the river that goes through this province that's highlighted in red, that's Deir ez-Zor. So to the east of that, the U.S. and the SDF control that territory. They control a lot of Syria, and it's where most of the country's oil resources are. It's where a lot of the country's wheat resources are, and this is all part of that economic campaign against Syria. So also on Friday, there was an attack reported at a U.S. military base at the Al Omar oil field, which is also in Deir ez-Zor. It's in the eastern, more rural part. But the U.S. has a base at an oil field in Syria. So it shows you that the occupation is, as Trump said, very much about, taking the oil, securing the oil, as he put it. And when I got this from the Cradle, they cited Russian media that said a major missile strike hit the U.S. base. And local sources said there were U.S. military casualties, but there's been no confirmation from the U.S. military. So right now we don't really know what happened here. And this was supposedly on Friday, but they made it sound like it was a major missile attack. But CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, they typically put out a press release when one of their bases in Syria comes under attack. And I haven't seen that. I haven't seen any confirmation from the U.S. about this attack. Who knows? Maybe they were off for New Year's because CENTCOM is based in Florida. They're not based in the Middle East. So the people that do press releases aren't actually over there. So maybe we'll see more on that. But it's just something to keep an eye on. All right, the next one here, Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, on Sunday, he ordered the exponential increase in the production of nuclear weapons as tensions continue to rise on the Korean peninsula. So this was in a statement released by North Korea's state media. Kim said that Pyongyang must bolster its military in the face of what he called dangerous military moves by the U.S. and other hostile forces that target North Korea. He said that the current tensions highlight the importance and necessity of as he put it, mass producing tactical nuclear weapons, and calls for an exponential increase of the country's nuclear arsenal. So 2022 saw a record number of North Korean weapons tests and missile launches. According to the New York Times, Pyongyang launched 95 missiles, including some ICBMs, and that's more than any other previous year. And what also happened in 2022 was the U.S. and South Korea resumed these large-scale war games where they're basically practicing bombing North Korea, right there, right on the Korean Peninsula, and the U.S. started sending bombers. So as I put it a lot, it's really just tit for tat escalation between North Korea and South Korea and the U.S. Or was I here? So North Korea, they ended 2022 by launching 3 ballistic missiles toward the Sea of Japan, and then they began the new year early on New Year's Day over there. They fired a short-range ballistic missile off their east coast. So, they're keeping this up, and here you have Kim saying that they're going to expand their nuclear arsenal. So it's just not a good situation, and we haven't seen any sign from the Biden administration that they even care about this, that they even care to try to defuse tensions. Instead, they're just giving South Korea what they want. Yeah, we'll send bombers over there. And the new President Yoon is more hawkish than his predecessor. So it's just the formula for tensions to keep rising and rising. If the U.S. really wanted to hold talks with North Korea, that's what their position is. They say they would have talks. But if they really meant it, they would have to offer something to North Korea. And something they could offer is a pause in war games, which that doesn't seem like a big deal. Or they could ease some sanctions or freeze some sanctions, something like that. But we haven't seen any movement in that direction. So it just seems like things are going to get worse over on the Korean Peninsula. All right, the next one here, the end of an era. Venezuela's opposition removes Juan Guaido as the interim president. So they did this on Friday, and they dissolved the interim government that Guaido headed. And so if you're not too familiar with this, with Venezuela, basically in 2019, this guy, Juan Guaido, who was an opposition figure, declared himself interim president of Venezuela, and he did it because he had the backing of the U.S. Then the U.S. and all of its EU allies recognized Guaido as president, even though Maduro was president. Nicolas Maduro is still the president of Venezuela, so it was a failed regime change effort. The Trump administration backed a coup against Maduro. I mean, and this was so overt. I remember it was in 2019. It was crazy. They were just openly trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Because coups, U.S. involvement in coups in South America is usually more covert, but they were just out there. This was when John Bolton was in the Biden administration, just saying, we're going to overthrow Maduro. But they failed. And a big part of the reason why they failed is because Guaido didn't really have much support. And after these failed coups and calling for foreign intervention, he really lost what little support he had. So he was never a serious contender to take over. And Maduro never arrested him, which is kind of funny. He just let him run around and do his thing. But so he's been removed. And if I understand this right, this was done by the Venezuelan opposition who were in the National Assembly, which is Venezuela's parliament. They won election in 2015 to the National Assembly seats. And then there was another election in 2020, but they didn't recognize it. So they're like kind of an interim National Assembly. Like they don't actually have any power in Caracas. But anyway, but the U.S., while this interim government never had power in Venezuela, they did get control of a lot of Venezuela's offshore assets and Venezuelan embassies in other countries because the U.S. and its allies gave them that control. So they've probably gotten a lot of money out of this, I bet. But anyway, so that's where we're at now. But so this decision to dissolve this interim government, it came after the opposition restarted talks with Maduro in November. And as a result of the renewed talks, the U.S. eased some sanctions pretty slightly, but they did ease some because the Trump administration's failed regime change effort came with really crippling sanctions, basically putting Venezuela under economic embargo. And Biden is easing some restrictions. They gave Chevron a limited license to restart pumping oil in Venezuela. And the deal will also release $3 billion in Venezuelan funds that were frozen by U.S. and European banks. And under this deal, those funds are supposed to go toward economic development projects, things like that. So I think these opposition parties, their strategy was just boycotting elections, and because they said that the 2018 presidential election that got Maduro another term was illegitimate, and that's why Guaido declared himself president. But now I think they're looking to get back into the elections. So I think that's another part of the reason why they did it. But it really is, officially over, this failed regime change by the U.S. But the sanctions are still mostly in place. So hopefully the U.S. lifts more sanctions. All right. So the next article here, Yemen's Houthis say that they seek a permanent ceasefire. So a Houthi spokesman said this on Sunday, that they're looking for a permanent ceasefire with the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition. So since there was a ceasefire that expired at the beginning of October, there's still been no Saudi airstrikes in Yemen, which is great news. There's been no Houthi attacks inside Saudi Arabia, but fighting on the ground has increased. It's gotten pretty intense lately. And Oman, Yemen's neighbor to the east there, they renewed diplomacy recently by their mediating talks right now between the Saudis and the Houthis. And an Omani delegation arrived in Sana'a, Yemen, on December 21st. So this Houthi spokesman said, quote, "We are working to reach a point of clarity in Yemen in which we move into either a permanent truce or ceasefire, and we have presented our point of view to the Omani mediator," end quote. So the Houthis, known formally as Ansar Allah, they want a full lifting of the blockade on Yemen and for government employees to be paid. So they're saying that any solution to this crisis, it must be based on government employees getting their salaries from oil and gas revenues. So I guess, and I know the Houthis have been kind of attacking oil facilities that are controlled still by the Saudi-backed government. That doesn't control much territory, but I guess they still control some of the oil. So they're saying that they're taking those profits from Yemen. So they want those profits to pay the government salaries. So hopefully, these talks have some traction. Unfortunately, the Houthis, sorry, not the Houthis, the U.S. Could have really pressured the Saudis to reach a final deal with that war powers resolution that was in Congress that would have ended U.S. support for the Saudi-led war. And the Saudi Air Force is almost entirely reliant on U.S. maintenance. So if that war powers resolution was passed and ended U.S. support, it would have just made them more likely to make a deal with the Houthis pretty quickly. It would have kind of forced their hand. But the Biden administration worked against it, and Bernie Sanders was going to introduce it to the Senate, but he caved under pressure. It was really pathetic, and he never introduced it. And now it's a new Congress. So that war powers resolution that got a ton of co-sponsors, especially in the House. It got over 100 co-sponsors in the House, including like 10 Republicans. So it could have passed the House. The Senate, they might have struggled with after the Biden administration was telling Democrats not to vote for it. But according to some activists and stuff that are very involved in this, they said there could have been enough votes because about 8 Republicans might have voted for it. So that was just such a shame. But hopefully, Oman, these efforts by them end this war because, we know that it's been a brutal war. 377,000 people at least have been killed, and more than half of those people died as a result of starvation and preventable disease caused by the U.S.-Saudi siege on the country. So if the Saudi airstrikes restart again, things can get really bad really quickly, and they're notorious for bombing civilians. So, hopefully there's an end brought to this war. But in the meantime, on the ground, Saudi shelling, there's been a lot of Saudi shelling in North Yemen, in the Sadr province that borders Saudi Arabia. And the Houthis have been attacking oil infrastructure, and they've also clashed recently with UAE-backed separatists known as the Southern Transitional Council. So things are getting pretty hot on the ground. All right, so the last article here, this is from Kyle Anzalone and Will Porter over at the Libertarian Institute. China conducts military maneuvers near Guam and Okinawa. So the Chinese aircraft carrier Liaoning, I probably said that wrong, Liaoning, has sailed near the Japanese island of Okinawa and the U.S. territory of Guam over the past 2 weeks. The naval operations came at the end of the year, which saw several military escalations between Washington and Beijing. Tokyo reported that this Chinese warship and at least 4 other large Chinese naval vessels operated in waters near Okinawa, adding that the ships remained about 150 miles offshore for several days. While in that area, the Chinese carrier conducted over 200 takeoff and landing drills. This came too right after China was drilling with Russia in the region. And the relationship between Washington and Beijing continued to deteriorate in 2022, perhaps best exemplified by Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan to last summer, which resulted in the largest ever Chinese military drills around Taiwan. And Biden has further fueled tensions by repeatedly asserting that U.S. forces would come to Taiwan's defense in the event of a Chinese invasion. So that's where we are at. And China has been doing more drills, in response to the last few years. We've seen a big increase in U.S. military activity in the South China Sea and near Taiwan. So it looks like that's going to continue. A lot of U.S. spy planes are buzzing around there. So things are, tensions are just going to continue rising in that region, especially as the U.S. is trying to build up more in the Asia Pacific. But that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have a lot of good ones. As always, we have one from Ted Snyder about Morocco and the hypocrisy. So Morocco is now the first African country to begin providing military assistance to Ukraine. They're going to give them some tanks. The U.S. is going to pay for it, of course, but they're still the first African country to do something like this. And Ted gets into how the Western Sahara that Morocco claims that the people that live there, don't consider themselves part of Morocco. And, there's a history behind it. I'm not too familiar with it, but I know part of Morocco's decision to normalize with Israel, because of that, the Trump administration recognized Morocco's sovereignty over the Western Sahara. And there's a lot of people there who reject that they're part of Morocco. So Ted's point here is that they're supporting Ukraine to defend themselves from Russia, who's kind of doing a similar thing to what Morocco's doing in the Sahara there. So go check that out. And we also have one from Gilbert Doctorow, Dehumanizing the Enemy, kind of just about the dehumanization of Russians and the way that, propaganda works in that regard. One from Daniel Larison about misinformation and the Iran debate. One from Ramsey Baroud about, what he's calling a looming Palestinian armed revolt. There's a large number of fighters. There's this newly formed Palestinian resistance group called the Lion's Den. And, 2022 was one of the deadliest years for Palestinians in the West Bank. And now with this new Israeli government coming in, we could really see something spark there. Also, our spotlight is from Glenn Greenwald over at his Substack, and it's about the new U.S. controls of TikTok. They're doing all these things to not get banned from the U.S. And one of the things that they've done is given handed control of content moderation to this new board that they created to kind of align more with the censorship that Facebook and Twitter and Instagram have always done, that align with the U.S. national security state. And Greenwald, he had a segment from his show critical of Zelensky, and it was deleted from TikTok. And that's not something China would want to delete, but it's certainly something the U.S. national security state might want removed. So it's pretty interesting. But that's it for me for today. First show of the year. Again, hope everybody had a good new year. Thanks a lot for supporting this show as we, started in our first year. Things have been going pretty good. I've already done over 100 episodes. Doesn't feel like I've been doing it that long, but I guess when I do it 5 times a week, they build up pretty quickly. But you could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey if you like the video. Most people listen to the audio version, the podcast version. So if you do that, that's great. You can also leave reviews wherever you listen to it on podcasts and tell people about it, share it around. That's it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Happy New Year. Thanks for listening.